The store was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of warm overhead lights reflecting off sleek black shelves lined with designer bags, shimmering watches, and rare custom suits. Malcolm Price, the owner of Prestige Noir, a luxury boutique nestled in the heart of the city, stood behind the counter, polishing a pair of gold cufflinks with deliberate care. His sharp tailored suit and calm demeanor spoke of a man who had built his empire from the ground up, despite countless obstacles. Prestige Noir wasn't just a store, it was a symbol of resilience and success, a space that celebrated excellence and broke barriers. But tonight, something felt off. The door chimed as a group of men walked in, their loud voices breaking the store's serene atmosphere. Malcolm's sharp eyes flickered to the reflection in the mirror behind the counter. They didn't look like customers. 5 of them, dressed in rough jeans and hoodies, their faces lined with a strange mix of arrogance and hostility. They moved with purpose, their presence heavy and invasive. Malcolm straightened, sliding the cufflinks into the drawer and closing it with a soft click. "Evening," he said, his voice steady and professional, though the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. The men didn't respond at first, exchanging knowing smirks with each other. One of them, a tall, wiry man with a shaved head and a sneer that seemed permanently etched on his face, finally turned to Malcolm. "Nice place you've got here," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "Thank you. Let me know if you need any assistance." Assistance. Another one laughed, stepping closer to a display of luxury handbags. He grabbed one off the shelf, turning it over in his hands as if inspecting it. "Yeah, we could use some assistance. Like, how much you think we could get for this on the street?" The others chuckled, their laughter echoing in the otherwise silent store. Malcolm's hand rested on the counter, his fingers lightly tapping the smooth surface as he calculated his next move. He wasn't afraid, not even close, but he knew these men didn't walk in for a friendly chat or an honest transaction. "You're welcome to look," Malcolm said calmly, "but I'd appreciate it if you handled the merchandise with care." The tall man snorted, stepping closer to Malcolm. "Care? Oh, we'll handle it all right. Matter of fact, we'll handle all of it. Place like this, all fancy and clean, doesn't belong to someone like you." The words hung in the air, a blatant jab at Malcolm's identity. He didn't flinch. His dark eyes met the man's glare, unblinking and unshaken. "Someone like me," Malcolm repeated, his tone measured. "And what exactly does that mean?" "Don't play dumb," the man shot back, leaning over the counter. "This neighborhood ain't yours. This business ain't yours. You don't belong here, and we're about to make sure you remember that." The laughter returned, harsh and grating. One of the men started sweeping items off a shelf, sending them crashing to the floor. Another pulled a display case open, grabbing whatever he could shove into his pockets. Malcolm didn't move. He didn't shout or panic. Instead, he watched them with an eerie stillness, like a predator studying its prey. The tall man noticed and frowned. "What, you think you're tough or something?" he snapped. "Think you can scare us?" Malcolm tilted his head slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I don't think anything," he said quietly. "I just know." The men froze, their movements halting as the words sank in. For the first time since they entered, the balance of power shifted ever so slightly. There was something in Malcolm's voice, something cold, something dangerous. The tall man scoffed, though his bravado wavered. "Yeah? And what exactly do you know, huh?" Malcolm stepped out from behind the counter, moving with a confidence that made the room feel smaller, tighter. His polished shoes clicked against the tile floor, each step deliberate and precise. He stopped a few feet away from the group, his hands relaxed at his sides. "I know that you picked the wrong store," he said, his voice low but unmistakably firm. "And the wrong man." The tension thickened, the air heavy with unspoken warnings. The group exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier arrogance dimming under the weight of Malcolm's unflinching gaze. "What, you think we're scared of you?" One of them blurted, though his voice lacked the conviction it had before. Malcolm didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a sleek black phone. He tapped the screen a few times before setting it on the counter. A video began to play. At first, the men didn't seem interested, but as the footage rolled, their expressions changed. The screen showed grainy security camera clips of a man, Malcolm, moving with a precision and ruthlessness that sent chills down their spines. It wasn't just the way he fought, it was the calm, calculated efficiency of someone who didn't make mistakes. A man who didn't hesitate. The tall man stepped back, his bravado crumbling. "No way, that's not you," he stammered. Malcolm didn't blink. It was. "What are you, some kind of hitman?" Another one whispered, his voice barely audible. Malcolm smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. Something like that. The room fell silent, the only sound the faint hum of the video still playing on the phone. The men stood frozen, their earlier confidence shattered. They had walked in thinking they could intimidate Malcolm Price, the owner of a high-end store. They hadn't realized they were standing face to face with someone whose past was darker than they could imagine. And now they had a choice to make. Malcolm took a step closer, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "The question is, what happens next?" The screen went black as the video ended, leaving the men staring at their reflections in the dark glass. Malcolm waited, his calm exterior masking the storm that brewed beneath the surface. The tension was unbearable, the silence stretching on as the group tried to decide if they were going to run, or if they were going to test their luck against a man who clearly wasn't afraid to let his past resurface. And that's where we'll leave it for now. What will they do? And just how much of Malcolm's past will be revealed? The room felt like it was holding its breath. The 5 men stared at Malcolm, their confidence unraveling with every passing second. Their earlier bravado had slipped through their fingers like sand, replaced by the heavy weight of realization. Malcolm stood calm, his hands relaxed at his sides, but his presence filled the room like a storm waiting to break. The tall man, who had led the charge with sneers and taunts, shifted uncomfortably on his feet. His earlier words now hung in the air like a bad joke no one wanted to acknowledge. He glanced at the others, searching for a spark of courage to reignite their bravado. But they all looked away, avoiding his eyes. "You're bluffing," the tall man muttered, though his voice lacked the bite it had before. He tried to laugh, but it came out forced, a weak attempt to reclaim control. "You don't scare us." Malcolm tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Bluffing," he repeated, his tone calm, almost amused. "If that's what helps you sleep at night, then sure. Let's call it that." The men exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence crumbling further under the weight of Malcolm's steady gaze. They didn't need to ask who he was anymore. The answer was clear in his calm demeanor, in the way he carried himself like someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to lose. But what scared them most wasn't the man standing before them. It was what he might be capable of. Malcolm let the silence stretch a little longer before finally breaking it. "You still haven't answered my question," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "What happens next?" For a moment, no one moved. It was as if they were all frozen, caught in the gravity of the moment. The tall man finally stepped back, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of surrender. "All right, man. We'll go," he said, his voice tight. "No need to make this a big deal." Malcolm's eyes didn't leave him, even as the group slowly began to back away. He could see the fear in their movements, the hesitation in their steps. They were retreating, but it wasn't over. Not yet. As the men reached the door, the tall one hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. He glanced back at Malcolm, his face twisted with a mix of anger and humiliation. "You think this is over?" he spat. "You'll regret this." Malcolm didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, unshaken. "You already do," he replied, his voice so calm it sent a chill down the man's spine. The door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing through the now quiet store. Malcolm stood still for a moment, his eyes lingering on the door as if expecting them to come back. But the silence held, and he finally exhaled, a slow, measured breath that released the tension he had kept locked inside. He turned and walked back to the counter, his polished shoes clicking softly against the floor. Reaching for the phone, he tapped the screen, erasing the video that had played moments ago. It wasn't the first time he had to remind someone that his past wasn't as far behind him as he wanted it to be, and it wouldn't be the last. As Malcolm slid the phone back into his pocket, his thoughts drifted to a time long before Prestige Noor, before he was a respected business owner known for his sharp eye and impeccable taste. Back then, he was someone else entirely, a man feared in circles most people didn't even know existed. It wasn't a life he was proud of, but it was a life that had shaped him. Growing up in a rough neighborhood, Malcolm had learned early on that survival meant being stronger, smarter, and faster than everyone else. He hadn't set out to become the man he eventually did, but circumstances had a way of forcing your hand. The streets had taught him everything he knew: how to fight, how to read people, how to see danger coming before it arrived. It was a world of unspoken rules and invisible lines, and Malcolm had mastered them all. By the time he was 25, his name alone was enough to make grown men think twice before crossing him. But that life came with a price. Malcolm had seen enough violence and betrayal to last a lifetime. He had lost friends, family, pieces of himself he could never get back. So when the opportunity came to leave it all behind, he took it. Prestige Noor was his way out, a chance to build something that was his and his alone. The store wasn't just a business, it was a statement. A reminder that he had beaten the odds, that he had risen above the chaos of his past. But no matter how far he tried to distance himself from that life, it always found a way to creep back in. Tonight was proof of that. As Malcolm began cleaning up the mess the men had left behind, his mind was already racing. He knew their type. They weren't the kind to take humiliation lightly. They would be back, maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but they would come. And when they did, Malcolm would be ready. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't possibly know, was that Malcolm Price wasn't just a man who survived. He was a man who thrived in the chaos. They had come into his store thinking they could intimidate him, not realizing they were stepping into a lion's den. But Malcolm had learned long ago that fear wasn't something you showed, it was something you instilled. As he locked up the store for the night, Malcolm glanced at his reflection in the glass door. He looked calm, composed, like any other successful business owner closing up shop. But behind that polished exterior was a man who had seen and done things most people couldn't imagine. He adjusted his tie and turned off the lights, leaving the store in darkness. As he walked to his car, the cool night air wrapped around him, carrying with it the faint hum of the city. He slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, his mind already working through the possibilities of what might come next. Because one thing was certain, this wasn't over. As Malcolm drove away, the city lights casting fleeting shadows across his face, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was just the beginning of something bigger. The men who had come into his store weren't the real problem. They were just pawns, acting out of arrogance and ignorance. But Malcolm knew better than to underestimate anyone. He had made that mistake once before, and it had nearly cost him everything. He would be ready. Because if there was one thing Malcolm Price had learned in his life, it was this: the past might shape you, but it didn't define you. And when the time came to face whatever was coming, he wouldn't face it as the man they thought they knew. He would face it as the man he truly was, the most feared killer they'd never see coming. The night stretched on as Malcolm drove through the city streets, his mind restless despite the calm exterior he wore like armor. He wasn't heading home, not yet. His instincts told him there was more to this than a group of petty troublemakers trying to prove a point. These things didn't happen in isolation, not in his world. If tonight was a warning, the real storm was still on its way. He turned onto a quieter street and parked in front of an unmarked brick building. The sign on the door read "Closed," but Malcolm knew better. He knocked twice, waited, and then knocked again in a specific rhythm. A moment later, the door opened a crack, and a wary set of eyes peered out. Price, the man behind the door, muttered, stepping aside to let him in. Malcolm nodded in greeting and walked into the dimly lit room. The air smelled faintly of cigar smoke and old leather, and the faint hum of conversation drifted from a back room. "Figured you'd show up tonight," the man said, locking the door behind him. "Heard some noise in your neck of the woods." "Word travels fast," Malcolm replied, his tone neutral. "What do you know?" The man, an older figure named Ray, was someone Malcolm trusted, at least as much as he trusted anyone these days. Ray had connections everywhere, and his knack for knowing things before anyone else did made him invaluable. "Couple of amateurs, from what I hear," Ray said, motioning for Malcolm to follow him into the back. "But they're running under someone. Couldn't get a name yet, but if they're sniffing around your store, it's not random." Malcolm sat down at the small table in the back room, his expression unreadable. "Someone's testing the waters." "Looks that way," Ray agreed, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey. He slid one across the table to Malcolm. "But here's the thing, you've been quiet for years, Price. Kept your head down, stayed out of the game. Why now? Why you?" Malcolm didn't answer right away. He stared at the glass in front of him, the amber liquid catching the low light. It was a good question, one he had been asking himself since the moment those men walked into his store, but the answer didn't matter as much as the solution. "Doesn't matter why," Malcolm said finally, lifting the glass and taking a slow sip. "What matters is stopping it before it goes any further." Ray studied him for a moment, his sharp eyes narrowing. "You sure you're ready for that? Going back into the game, there's no halfway. Once you're in, you're in." "I don't have a choice," Malcolm replied, his voice steady. "They came to me, Ray. That makes it personal." Ray leaned back in his chair, letting out a low whistle. "All right," he said, nodding slowly. "But you're gonna need to watch your back. Whoever's behind this, they're not just poking around for fun." Malcolm didn't need the reminder. He knew the rules of this world better than anyone. You didn't make moves unless you were prepared to finish them. And whoever was behind this had made their first move. Now it was his turn. He left Ray's place with more questions than answers, but at least now he had a direction. He would start by finding out who those men were and what they wanted. And if they were connected to someone bigger, it wouldn't take long to uncover the truth. People talked, and Malcolm had a way of getting answers. The next day, Malcolm returned to the store early, scanning the security footage from the night before. He watched the men carefully, studying their movements, their faces, every detail he could extract. One of them had a tattoo on his neck, a crude design that looked like a snake coiled around a dagger. It was faint, almost hidden under his hoodie, but Malcolm caught it. That was a start. He made a few calls, sending the image to some old contacts who still owed him favors. Within hours, one of them got back to him. The tattoo belonged to a local gang known as the Vipers. They weren't major players, but they had a reputation for aligning themselves with more dangerous groups when it suited them. The information didn't sit well with Malcolm. The Vipers weren't bold enough to target someone like him on their own. They had to be working under orders, which meant someone bigger was pulling the strings. But who and why? As the day went on, Malcolm kept the store running as if nothing had happened. Customers came and went, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. He smiled, made polite conversation, and sold high-end items to people who would never guess the life he had lived before. But beneath the polished exterior, his mind was racing. He was piecing together the puzzle, analyzing every angle, every possibility. He knew the importance of staying one step ahead. If he waited too long, whoever was behind this would take the next step, and he couldn't afford to be caught off guard. That evening, as Malcolm looked up the store, he noticed something out of place. A black SUV was parked across the street, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. It hadn't been there earlier, and it didn't feel like a coincidence. Malcolm's instincts kicked in, the years of training and experience taking over. He walked to his car with casual ease, but his senses were on high alert. He could feel eyes on him, the weight of someone watching. Sliding into the driver's seat, he started the engine and pulled away, his gaze flicking to the rearview mirror. The SUV followed. Malcolm didn't panic. Instead, he drove through the city streets with calculated precision, taking turns at random, weaving through traffic to confirm what he already suspected. The SUV stayed on him, keeping its distance but never losing sight. A test, he thought. They were watching him, trying to see how he'd react. But if they thought they were in control, they were wrong. Malcolm took a sharp turn down an alley, killing his headlights as he parked in the shadows. He stepped out of the car and melted into the darkness, his movements silent and deliberate. The SUV rolled past the alley, its occupants unaware that they had just lost their target. Malcolm watched from the shadows, his expression cold and calculating. He didn't know who was in the SUV, but he didn't need to. Not yet. They had made one thing clear. They were watching, and they wanted him to know it. As the SUV disappeared into the night, Malcolm exhaled slowly. The game had officially begun, and he was ready to play. But what they didn't realize, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that Malcolm Price had never lost a game like this, and he didn't plan to start now. The tension hung in the air like a storm about to break, every moment pulling Malcolm deeper into the game he had worked so hard to leave behind. He knew the SUV wasn't a coincidence. It was a message, just like the group of men from the night before, a signal that someone was closing in, testing the waters, seeing how far they could push before he pushed back. Over the next few days, Malcolm noticed more signs. The same SUV parked 2 blocks down, a figure lingering just a little too long outside his store, a shadow that disappeared as soon as he turned his head. Whoever was watching him wanted him to know they were there, but they weren't ready to make their move. Not yet. Malcolm didn't let it show. To anyone walking into Prestige Noir, he was the same polished, composed business owner he had always been. He greeted customers with a calm smile, helped them find what they needed, and kept the store running like nothing was wrong. But inside, he was a coiled spring, every sense heightened, every move calculated. The days turned into nights, each one filled with more questions than answers. Malcolm's old contacts were working overtime, piecing together fragments of information, trying to connect the dots. The Vipers were involved, that much was clear, but they weren't the ones pulling the strings. They were errand boys, pawns in a bigger game. And Malcolm knew exactly how to flush out the ones holding the leash. It was just past midnight when he found himself back at Ray's place. The dimly lit room felt heavier than before, the air thick with the weight of unspoken tension. Ray sat across from him, a cigar smoldering in his hand as he looked Malcolm over. "You sure you want to do this?" Ray asked, his voice low and cautious. "You're poking a bear, Price. Might not like what you find." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I don't have a choice, Ray. If I wait for them to come to me, I'm already playing their game. I need to take control." Ray nodded slowly, exhaling a plume of smoke. "All right," he said. "I made some calls. Got a location. Warehouse on the south side. Vipers have been using it as a base for a while now. If you're looking for answers, that's where you'll find them." Malcolm didn't need to ask for more details. He knew the area, knew the kind of people who operated there. It was the kind of place where deals were made in the shadows and questions were answered with violence. But that didn't faze him. If anything, it felt familiar, a reminder of who he used to be. He left Ray's place without a word, his mind already focused on what came next. The warehouse wasn't far, and the streets were quiet as he drove, the city wrapped in a blanket of uneasy silence. The closer he got, the more his instincts kicked in, every muscle in his body taut with anticipation. The warehouse loomed ahead, a hulking structure that seemed to breathe with its own kind of menace. Malcolm parked a few blocks away and approached on foot, his steps silent as he melted into the shadows. He moved with purpose, his sharp eyes scanning every angle, every detail. Outside, two men stood by the entrance, their postures casual but alert. They didn't see Malcolm until it was too late. He moved like a ghost, his strikes precise and efficient, leaving them unconscious before they even knew he was there. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of crates and dimly lit corridors. Voices echoed faintly, the low murmur of men who thought they were safe. Malcolm followed the sound, his movements silent and deliberate, each step bringing him closer to the heart of the operation. He found them in a large open space at the center of the warehouse. A group of men stood around a table, maps and papers spread out before them. At the head of the table was a man Malcolm didn't recognize, tall, lean, with an air of authority that set him apart from the others. This wasn't some low-level thug. This was someone who mattered. Malcolm stayed in the shadows, listening as they spoke. Their words were cryptic, but the intent was clear. They were planning something big, something that went far beyond a luxury store in the city. The Vipers were just a piece of the puzzle, a small cog in a much larger machine. And then Malcolm heard a name he hadn't heard in years, a name that stopped him cold. Lover Kane. The room seemed to close in around him as the realization hit. Kane was a ghost from Malcolm's past, a man whose ambition and ruthlessness had left a trail of destruction in his wake. Malcolm had crossed paths with him once years ago in a life he thought he had left behind. And now Kane was back, and somehow Malcolm was in his sights. The pieces began to fall into place, the threads connecting in ways Malcolm hadn't anticipated. Kane wasn't just testing him. He was sending a message, pulling Malcolm back into a world he had fought so hard to escape. Malcolm's grip tightened, his mind racing as he considered his next move. He couldn't let them see him, not yet. He needed more information, more leverage. But as he turned to slip back into the shadows, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement, a reflection in the glass. He wasn't alone. Before he could react, the sound of a gun being cocked cut through the air, sharp and unmistakable. Malcolm froze, his mind calculating the distance, the angles, the odds. A voice followed, low and smug. Well, the man said. Looks like we've got ourselves a visitor. The tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight, and Malcolm slowly turned to face the man behind him. He was younger, cocky, with a grin that spoke of someone who thought he had the upper hand. But Malcolm had been in worse situations, and he wasn't about to let this one be his last. Malcolm stood still, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a vice. The younger man with the cocky grin held a pistol, its barrel steady as it pointed directly at Malcolm. His confidence was loud, but Malcolm could see the slight tremor in his hand, the way his breath hitched ever so slightly. He wasn't as in control as he wanted to believe. Didn't think you'd get caught so easily, the man sneered. The great Malcolm Price, sneaking around like some common thief. Malcolm's face betrayed no emotion, his calm unnerving. He met the man's gaze, unflinching, as he calculated the distance between them, the time it would take to close the gap, and the likelihood that the noise will alert the others in the room just beyond. Every second felt stretched, the weight of the moment balanced on a knife's edge. You talk too much, Malcolm said finally, his voice low and steady. The man's smirk faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered, tightening his grip on the gun. Not so tough now, are you? But before we could say anything else, the faintest sound of a footstep behind him broke the tension. The man turned his head slightly, just enough for Malcolm to make his move. In one fluid motion, he disarmed him, the gun clattering to the floor as Malcolm struck with precision, rendering the man unconscious before he could even shout. Malcolm stood over him, his breathing controlled, his mind already racing to the next step. He knew the commotion wouldn't go unnoticed for long. He had to move quickly. But as he reached for the man's weapon, a voice echoed from the room ahead, sharp and commanding. Bring him in. Malcolm froze. They knew he was here. The room ahead erupted in movement, the sounds of chairs scraping against the floor, boots echoing against the concrete. He could hear the unmistakable clink of weapons being readied. They weren't just sending someone to check, they were preparing for a confrontation. Malcolm stayed low, his mind racing. They were baiting him, trying to draw him out. But if they thought he'd fall into their trap, they didn't know who they were dealing with. He moved silently, slipping into the maze of crates, using the shadows to his advantage. The layout of the warehouse worked in his favor, offering enough cover to stay hidden, but he knew it wouldn't last forever. And then, amidst the chaos, he heard it again, Lover Kane's name. This time, it wasn't just a mention, it was a direct command. Lover wants him alive, no mistakes. The words were enough to send a chill down Malcolm's spine. Kane wasn't just pulling strings from the shadows, he was directly involved. The stakes had just skyrocketed, and Malcolm knew this wasn't just about intimidation anymore. Kane wanted him for something specific, and whatever it was, it couldn't be good. As Malcolm maneuvered through the warehouse, he began to piece together a plan. He needed leverage, something that would shift the power dynamic in his favor. And then, as he rounded a corner, he found it. A stack of crates labeled with the Viper's insignia, their contents partially exposed. Guns, ammunition, enough firepower to outfit a small army. This wasn't just a gang's hideout, it was an arsenal. And if Kane was involved, this was likely just one piece of a much larger operation. But before Malcolm could inspect further, a new voice cut through the air, closer than before. This one was calm, almost conversational, but laced with menace. "Price, you've been busy." Malcolm turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he faced the source of the voice. It wasn't Lover Kane, but it was someone close. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a cold, calculating gaze stepped forward, flanked by two others, their weapons trained on Malcolm. "You didn't really think you could just walk in here and snoop around, did you?" The man continued, his tone almost amused. "Lover's been waiting for this moment. He'll be disappointed if I bring you in too early." Malcolm didn't respond, his expression unreadable as he took in every detail. The way the man held himself, the positioning of the others, the angles of their weapons. He could feel the tension in the room, the way the balance of power was shifting with every passing second. The man smirked, clearly enjoying the supposed upper hand. "You've got quite the reputation, Price, but I've got to say I expected more. You're slipping." Malcolm's jaw tightened, his patience thinning. "And you're talking like a man who doesn't know how this ends." The smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Malcolm took a step forward, his movements deliberate and measured, forcing the man to shift slightly, his composure wavering. "I've seen men like you before," Malcolm continued, his voice low and steady. "You think you've got it all figured out. You think your plan is airtight. But let me tell you something. Kane made a mistake coming for me, and you're about to make one too." The man's confidence faltered, and in that split second, Malcolm made his move. He lunged forward, disarming one of the guards before they could react, using the weapon to force the others to retreat. The chaos erupted in an instant, the sound of gunfire echoing through the warehouse as Malcolm used the environment to his advantage, outmaneuvering his attackers with precision. But as he fought his way through the chaos, one thing became increasingly clear. This wasn't just about him. The arsenal, the Vipers, Kane's involvement, it was all connected to something much bigger. And whatever it was, Malcolm had just stumbled into the center of it. By the time the dust settled, Malcolm stood alone in the middle of the warehouse, his breathing heavy but controlled. The others had fled, their leader among them, leaving behind a trail of chaos and unanswered questions. As Malcolm scanned the room, his gaze fell on a folder left on the table, its contents spilling out. Maps, blueprints, a list of names, all tied to Kane's operation. He gathered the papers quickly, knowing they held the key to understanding Kane's plan. But as he turned to leave, a new sound stopped him in his tracks, the low rumble of an engine, growing louder by the second. He turned toward the entrance just in time to see a sleek black car pull up, its headlights cutting through the darkness. And stepping out of the car was Lover Kane himself. Malcolm's heart thudded in his chest as the car door opened, and Lover Kane stepped out, dressed in a sharp black suit that somehow seemed to amplify his presence. He carried himself with the air of a man who always got what he wanted, his expression unreadable but charged with purpose. The dim light from the warehouse reflected off his polished shoes as he approached, his movements slow, deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. Malcolm stood his ground, the weight of the folder clutched in his hand, his other hand ready to reach for the gun he had taken during the chaos. But he didn't make a move, not yet. He needed to see what Kane wanted, to understand why the man had gone to such lengths to pull him back into this dangerous world. "You've made quite a mess, Price," Kane said, his voice smooth and calm, as though they were old friends catching up over drinks. He stopped a few feet away, his hands casually in his pockets. "It's almost nostalgic, isn't it? You and me, standing on opposite sides of the line." Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He refused to give Kane the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, he studied him, searching for any hint of weakness, any clue that might give him an advantage. Kane tilted his head slightly, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "I have to admit, you've done well for yourself. The luxury store, the clean-cut image, it's impressive. But you and I both know you can't outrun what you are. No matter how hard you try, the past always catches up." Malcolm's voice was low, steady as he finally spoke. "What do you want, Kane?" Kane's smirk widened, as if he'd been waiting for that question. "Oh, it's not about what I want, Malcolm. It's about what you've got. That store of yours, it's more than just a business, isn't it? It's leverage, connections, influence, and in my line of work, those things are invaluable." Malcolm's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on the folder. "So this is about taking what's mine." Kane laughed softly, shaking his head. "Not taking, Malcolm. Partnering. You see, I've built an empire, but even empires have blind spots. I need someone who understands both sides of the game, someone with your unique skill set." The offer hung in the air, but Malcolm didn't need time to think. He already knew his answer. "I'm not interested," he said firmly. Kane's expression darkened, the playful edge in his tone replaced by something colder. "That's unfortunate," he said, "because I wasn't really asking." Before Malcolm could respond, a sharp whistle echoed through the warehouse, and suddenly, more figures emerged from the shadows. They were armed and positioned strategically, blocking every possible exit. Kane had come prepared. Malcolm's mind raced as he assessed the situation. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and boxed in. But he wasn't out of options. He glanced down at the folder in his hand, the pieces of Kane's operation laid out in black and white. It was his only leverage, and he needed to use it wisely. "Kane," Malcolm said, his voice cutting through the tension. "You think you've got me cornered, but you've underestimated one thing." Kane raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And what's that?" Malcolm took a step forward, his eyes locked on Kane's. "I'm not the same man you used to know. I've built something real, something worth protecting, and I won't let you take it." Kane smirked again, but before he could respond, Malcolm threw the folder into the air, the papers scattering like confetti. The distraction was enough to create chaos, giving Malcolm the opening he needed. He moved swiftly, disarming one of the guards and using him as a shield as the others scrambled to react. The warehouse erupted into chaos, the sound of gunfire echoing through the space as Malcolm fought his way through the maze of crates and shadows. He moved with precision and purpose, his every action calculated to create confusion and level the playing field. Despite the odds, he held his ground, the instincts he thought he'd left behind kicking in like second nature. But Kane wasn't just watching. He stepped into the fray, his movements smooth and controlled as he drew a weapon and joined the fight. It became a deadly game of cat and mouse, with Malcolm and Kane circling each other, their paths crossing briefly before disappearing again into the chaos. Finally, the two men found themselves face to face in the center of the warehouse, the noise fading into the background as they squared off. Kane raised his weapon, but Malcolm was faster, knocking it from his hand with a well-placed strike. The two men grappled, their fight brutal and unrelenting, each one determined to come out on top. As they fought, Malcolm realized something was off. Kane wasn't fighting to win, he was stalling. And then he saw it. A small device clipped to Kane's belt, its red light blinking ominously. It wasn't just an arsenal, it was a trap. The entire warehouse was rigged to blow. "You're out of time, Price," Kane said through gritted teeth, a twisted smile on his face. "If I can't have you, no one will." Malcolm didn't hesitate. He landed a final devastating blow, knocking Kane unconscious before grabbing the device and sprinting toward the exit. The seconds ticked down as he ran, the warehouse collapsing into chaos behind him. He barely made it out before the explosion rocked the building, the force of it sending him sprawling to the ground. When the dust settled, Malcolm stood, battered but alive, staring at the smoldering remains of the warehouse. Kane's empire had taken a major hit, but Malcolm knew this wasn't over. Kane had escaped, and the battle between them was far from finished. As Malcolm turned to leave, he felt the weight of everything he'd fought for, the life he'd built, the people he cared about, settling on his shoulders. He wasn't the man he used to be, but he also wasn't someone to be underestimated. And as long as Kane was out there, Malcolm knew he'd have to stay one step ahead. But then, just as he thought it was over, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his heart sinking as he read the message. Asterisk, asterisk, this isn't the end. LK asterisk, asterisk. Malcolm stared at the screen, his jaw tightening as he realized the final twist. Kane wasn't just after him. He was after everything Malcolm stood for, and the fight had only just begun. The cold night air stung Malcolm's face as he slipped the phone back into his pocket, Kane's cryptic message still glowing in his mind. He stood there for a moment, staring at the smoldering remains of the warehouse, the acrid smell of smoke filling the air. The fire danced against the dark sky, a grim reminder of the war he thought he'd left behind. But even as exhaustion weighed on him, Malcolm knew one thing for sure: he was still standing, and as long as he was, he wouldn't let Kane win. The next few days were a blur. Malcolm returned to his store, doing his best to pick up the pieces. The shattered glass had been replaced, the shelves restocked, and his employees reassured. On the surface, everything seemed to return to normal. But Malcolm could feel the tension bubbling beneath, an invisible thread tying him back to the chaos he had fought so hard to escape. The store had always been his sanctuary, a symbol of the life he'd rebuilt. Now it felt more like a target, and he hated that Kane had taken even a piece of that away from him. He spent hours poring over the scattered documents he'd salvaged from the warehouse before the explosion. There were gaps, but the pieces started to come together. Kane's operation wasn't just about smuggling or weapons, it was about control. He'd been using fear, power, and influence to weave his web across the city, infiltrating businesses, law enforcement, and anyone else he could manipulate. And Malcolm's store, with its high-profile clientele and connections, was supposed to be the latest piece of his empire. What Kane hadn't counted on was Malcolm's refusal to play by his rules. That stubborn streak, the same one that had made Malcolm a legend in his old life, was the very thing Kane had underestimated, and now it was the reason Malcolm couldn't walk away. If he didn't act, Kane's shadow would continue to spread, pulling more innocent people into its grasp. But Malcolm also knew he couldn't face this alone. Not anymore. One night, as he sat in his office, his eyes fixed on a map pinned to the wall with Kane's key locations marked in red, there was a knock on the door. Malcolm tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon he now kept close. But when he opened the door, he saw familiar faces, his employees, his trusted confidants, the people who had stood by him through everything. They didn't say much, but the determination in their eyes spoke volumes. "We're with you," one of them said simply, setting a bag of equipment on the desk. "Whatever it takes." Malcolm was struck by their loyalty, their willingness to stand by him despite the danger. It was a reminder that the life he'd built wasn't just about him. It was about the community, the people he'd brought together, the trust they'd placed in him. He nodded, a rare but genuine smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Then let's finish this. Over the next few weeks, Malcolm and his team worked in secret, dismantling Kane's operation piece by piece. They hit his supply lines, exposed his corrupted contacts, and leaked just enough information to put pressure on his allies without drawing too much attention to themselves. It wasn't easy. There were close calls, moments when it felt like the walls were closing in, but Malcolm's precision and experience guided them through. At the same time, Malcolm reached out to an old friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in years, but trusted implicitly. Detective Jordan Hayes had always walked the thin line between justice and politics, and Malcolm knew that if anyone could help bring Kane down legally, it was him. Their reunion was tense, the weight of their shared history lingering in the air, but Hayes listened, and more importantly, he believed. "This is dangerous, Malcolm," Hayes warned, scanning the files Malcolm had brought him. "You're putting a target on your back." Malcolm met his gaze, his voice steady. "There's already a target. I'm just making sure it hits the right person." Hayes nodded, slipping the files into his briefcase. "I'll do what I can, but you need to be careful. Kane doesn't leave loose ends." That warning echoed in Malcolm's mind as the final pieces of their plan fell into place. Kane was smart, ruthless, and always one step ahead. But Malcolm had something Kane didn't: people he trusted, people who believed in the fight. And with their help, he was about to deliver the blow that Kane would never see coming. The final confrontation wasn't in some shadowy warehouse or dark alley. It was in broad daylight, at one of Kane's legitimate businesses, a high-rise office building in the heart of the city. Malcolm knew the audacity of the move would catch Kane off guard. It was risky, but it was the only way to ensure the message was heard loud and clear. Malcolm walked into the building alone, his head held high, his every step deliberate. The lobby was sleek, modern, and filled with people who had no idea of the man they worked for. He made his way to the elevator, the tension building with every floor it climbed. When the doors opened, Kane was waiting. "Price," Kane said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You've been busy." Malcolm stepped out, his expression calm but unyielding. "You made it personal, Kane, and you underestimated me." Kane chuckled, gesturing for his men to stand down. "You really think you can walk in here and—" But before he could finish, Malcolm slid a flash drive across the table. "I don't have to do anything. The evidence is already in the right hands. By now, your accounts are frozen, your allies are jumping ship, and your name is about to be all over the news. It's over." For the first time, Kane's confidence faltered. He picked up the drive, his jaw tightening as he realized the scope of what Malcolm had done. "You think this changes anything? People like me don't just disappear." Malcolm stepped closer, his voice low. "Maybe not. But you're about to find out what happens when you lose everything." The tension in the room was electric as Kane's men exchanged uneasy glances. They could sense the shift, the cracks in Kane's armor. And as Malcolm turned to leave, he knew the battle wasn't just about winning. It was about proving that no one, not even someone like Kane, was untouchable. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from Kane's downfall rippled through the city. His empire crumbled, his assets seized, and his name dragged into the light. Malcolm watched from a distance, his store bustling with life once again. It wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for everyone who had been hurt, manipulated, or silenced by Kane's greed. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Malcolm stood in the doorway of his store, the warmth of the community buzzing around him. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. The fight was over, and he'd come out the other side stronger, not just for himself, but for the people he cared about. But even as he turned to lock up for the night, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, a faint smile playing on his lips as he read the message from Hayes. Asterisk asterisk you did good, Price. Take care of yourself. Asterisk asterisk. Malcolm slipped the phone back into his pocket and walked into the night, the weight of the past finally lifting. The scars were still there, and the memories would always linger, but he found something worth fighting for. And for the first time, he felt ready to let the future unfold, one step at a time.